Okay, you can go ahead and let people in.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us tonight. The program will start shortly, but first, a little housekeeping. You will be muted throughout the program, and we recommend that you use speaker view found in the top right-hand corner of your screen to best view the program. It is now my pleasure to welcome Judy Colton.
Thank you for joining us this evening. I am Judy Colton. Along with my husband, Stuart, we are chairing tonight's program, a virtual tour of the Anne Frank House. Stuart and I are delighted to gather with all of you for this very special program. Tonight, our facilitator will be Elise Schoenbrunn, Director of Holocaust Education and Newark Initiatives at Federation of Greater Metro West. Through both programs, Elise works to ensure the Holocaust education is taught broadly in public, private, and parochial schools throughout our community. The Holocaust Council also offers the Survivors Speaks program and Holocaust Human Interesting program to our Greater Metro West community. Elise, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. Right before our world was so greatly changed, in February of 2020, I had the pleasure of visiting the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, even getting the privilege to sit at Otto Frank's desk where Anne did much of her writing. And while I know we all wish to be able to return to those days when we could actually visit places in person, I am so thrilled to have Aaron Petterer and Morgan Bailey join us this evening and take us on this special access tour of the secret annex of Anne Frank and her family. Aaron, all the way from Austria, we thank you for being up in the middle of the night to lead us, and Morgan from South Carolina. We welcome you both to Greater Metro West. We will have time to take questions from the chat at the end of the tour. So if you have some questions, feel free to add them into the chat. And with that, I introduce Aaron and Morgan to all of you.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, friends in New Jersey. My name is Aaron, and I work for the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. Although I'm not in Amsterdam right now, I'm actually based in Austria. I'm still in the same CET time zone. So right now it's about 1 a.m. and that's very special that I can be with you tonight. I work for the Educational Projects Department. in the Anne Frank House. And usually, I travel a lot through the United States with our traveling exhibition Anne Frank: A History for Today. I visit schools and train young students to become peer guides of the Anne Frank exhibition. And today I will be one of your hosts while I guide you through the secret annex in the Anne Frank House. I won't be on my own. I will be doing the guided tour together with my colleague Morgan from South Carolina.
Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Bailey, and like was just mentioned, I'm here in South Carolina. So I have the privilege of working for a partnership between the University of South Carolina, the Anne Frank Center in New York, and the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. And I work primarily on the educational programs that Aaron was just describing. So whenever there are projects in schools and communities throughout the US, Aaron is our European contact that makes all of that happen. And then I'm the stateside rep here. And so Aaron and I partner up usually many times a year for these programs. Of course, that's not able to happen right now. But in the meantime, until we're able to be together again in person, very happy to be here with you tonight in this virtual way.
Okay, now before we start, I heard that we have grandparents and their grandkids actually as families watching the guided tour through the house. So we're totally happy about that fact. We will first go through the house, and then there will be lots of time for questions that might come up or for comments. So we'll be happy to answer them for you. Now, I assume, or at least I hope, that most of you have watched the short documentary, Anne Frank, The Short Life of Anne Frank. This is also a documentary we use in our workshops all over the world, actually. And it gives you a good overview of the place that we will be taking you right now. First, I'd like to start with this aerial shot of the Jordan district, and this special shot actually shows you the Westermarkt, which is the block of houses that contains the museum, the Anne Frank House. Now this is typical for Amsterdam. On the left-hand side you have one canal, on the right-hand side another canal, the Prinsen Canal and the Keizers Canal, Prinsengracht and Keizersgracht. The church here is called the Western Church. And the church tower actually contains the bells that Anne also describes in her diary. And this highlighted building here, this is Prinsengracht number 263. And this is what we know today as the Anne Frank House, which consists of the front part of the house and the back part of the house. And today, for those of you who might have been or might have visited the Anne Frank House, the museum actually stretches around this southern part of the block. Now, just to give you a little idea of what made this place the ideal hiding place, I'll take you back to the 1630s in Amsterdam. This is when this house was built, also known as the Golden Age of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Now, when houses were built on these canals, or next to these canals, the space to build them on was very limited. So building a house was very expensive. Now, people who wanted to build a house, the merchants who also lived there, were taxed on the width of their houses, which meant that they built quite narrow but very high houses. And if they needed extra space, they created a back house in the backyard. This back house was very often separated by a halo, which made it possible to get sunlight into the back house and the other parts of the front house. And here in the backyard, you actually still see a chestnut tree. And this chestnut tree is the one that Anne Frank writes about in her diary. So again, we have the front house and the back house. The Frank family and the other people in hiding were in this back house. From the front, you actually don't see the secret hiding place. All right. Now, let me take you inside the house. Now, Morgan and I will be returning to this 3D model quite a lot. Again, the front part of the house and the back part of the house. Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, actually rented this building for his company, Opekta. And Opekta produced jelly for jam. Now, if we have a look at this area, this will already be very special, because what we will show you is actually the VR version, so the virtual reality version of the hiding place, which means that we will see what it used to look like when Anne Frank and her family and the other people in hiding were living in this place for more than 2 years. So today, when you walk through the house, you won't find any furniture, you won't find these boxes. There is a glass plate covering this staircase, and the museum route will take you through this door to this revolving bookcase. Now, this bookcase is very special because the actual helpers, and we'll get to them later on, built this bookcase. Of course, Anne Frank and the other people in hiding were in constant fear of being discovered and deported. So the helpers tried to conceal the hiding place. And how did they do that? Well, for instance, by creating this revolving bookcase and mounting it just outside the door. These windows were covered with glass paper, and everything looked like just a storage place for the office. Morgan will now take you through the revolving bookcase into the back part of the house, into the secret annex.
Okay, so here we can see exactly what it looked like when you walked through that bookcase. Now we land here, and to orient us a little bit, I'll show you behind us here is the door that we just came through. And now what we're actually going to do is take a look at the multiple floors that were in this hiding place. You can see this door here and this door here. So we're going to go through this door on the left, and we're going to make a loop on the first floor. And then we're going to come through this door and go up these stairs right here, which I will go ahead and tell you, if you have been to the Anne Frank house before, then you know these stairs are incredibly steep and incredibly narrow. I don't have very big feet, but even my small feet can't totally fit on these steps. So you really have to be careful when you're walking through this space, which of course makes me think about what it would have been like to have to be so quiet the whole time. Now, we're going to go through this door here on the left, and the first official furnished room of the hiding place is the bedroom of Otto, Edith, and Margot Frank. So we'll take a look here. And like Erin mentioned, this is a really unique and special view because none of the furniture that you're seeing here is still there in person. And really the reason for that goes back to Otto Frank. As I'm sure most of you know, Otto was the only survivor out of the 8 people who were here in hiding. And after the war, after the liberation, when he came back, he found this place completely empty of all furniture. And he said that he wanted it to stay that way. He said that he knew that eventually Amsterdam and the Netherlands, Europe, and really the world was going to move on, and that this was going to become a part of history. And so he wanted there to be at least one place in the city that really just stood still in time, and that could serve not only as a museum one day, but also as a memorial, so that when you walk in, you are standing in the space that is very much unchanged from what it was like in 1945. Now, the reason it was completely empty is because all the furniture had been taken after the arrest. Property values of Jewish people were not respected. They were considered to be criminals because they did not obey the law, of course, that would have required them to go into the camps. They went into hiding, and because they were considered criminals, their belongings weren't respected. And so there were companies that would come and take away all of their furniture, sell it to make a profit. So when you go in person, you see this completely empty space. And sometimes we get this question, it's so much more open, it's so much more spacious than I imagined this hiding place would be. And so we often have to remind people, well, remember, when it was furnished, it really wasn't. You're not standing in this big empty room. You'd be standing in a room with multiple beds and tables and chairs and all of these kinds of things. Now, something else that I wanted to point out to you, here on this little ledge are the prayer books of Edith Frank. Edith was a religious person. She went to synagogue regularly. And I have to imagine that when they were going into hiding, they knew they couldn't take very many of their personal belongings. And so the things that you choose to take with you are going to mean a lot to you. And so one of the things that Edith made sure to bring was her prayer books. Now, the rest of the family wasn't quite as religious as Edith. Otto and Anne were more similar in that regard. They celebrated all of the holidays. They went to synagogue for special occasions and when mom wanted them to go. But for the most part, Edith and Margot were a little bit more observant. And then the last thing in this room that I want to show you is here on the walls. And these are actually still there. The first is a map where Otto Frank was tracking the invasion of the troops at Normandy. They would listen to the radio and he would use these push pins to mark where the troops had landed, of course, hoping and praying for the day that Amsterdam would be liberated and hoping that they would be there when that happened. And of course, we know that the timing did not work out that way. Now, the other piece on the wall here is actually my favorite space in the hiding place, and to me, the most moving. And it's where we can see Otto and Edith tracked the growth of their girls and their height during the 2+ years that they were in hiding. Anne grew about 13 centimeters, Margot only a few because she was 3 years older. And so she had already gone through that growth spurt that a 13 or 14-year-old might go through. But to me, this is really powerful because it can be easy to distance ourselves from this kind of history when we think about where we live today, especially young people in school learning about this history. It can seem like it was a really long time ago, even though we know it actually wasn't. And it can seem like we don't have a whole lot in common with the people in the story and this history. But when you see something like this, to me, it's a really good reminder that even if we've grown up in totally different countries, we speak very different languages, they were a normal family. They were parents who loved their kids, who wanted to document as they grew up. And that's something that I think a lot of families do. And it's just a good reminder that I think we always have more in common than we do different. So Aaron is now going to take us through this door and show us the next bedroom on this floor.
Thank you, Morgan. Now, this is the room of Anne Frank and of Mr. Fritz Pfeffer. Now, for those of you who have read the diary, and of course, for those of you who have watched the documentary, first of all, why did Anne Frank actually share a room with Mr. Fritz Pfeffer, who was a grown-up man, right? He was a dentist, many years older than Anne. Now, the reason was that when Anne and her family moved in, that was on July 6th, 1942, there was only another family who joined a week later, the Van Pels family. And they had a son, Peter, and it was decided that the Van Pels family would sleep upstairs, the second floor, and the Frank family would sleep in the first floor. Anne and her sister would initially share this bedroom and her parents in the other room. But then, when in November of 1942, Mr. Fritz Pfeffer joined the hiding place, he was also Jewish, also from Germany, also needed a place to hide. He asked Mipchis, one of the helpers. She said, yes, I will ask. And actually, the people in hiding decided we do have space for one more. But then where should he sleep? Because nobody wanted to rip apart the families, but the decision was made that Anne had to stay in this room with Mr. Fritz Pfeffer because she was considered still a girl, a young child. Whereas Margot, who Morgan already said was older, was considered a young woman. And it was inappropriate for a young woman to share a bedroom with a grown man. This is the reason why Anne shared this room with Mr. Fritz Pfeffer. Now, what did Anne do? When she moved in, she made this room her room, which means that she decorated the room with posters, with pictures. There's this cinema, which is there's this a magazine, which is also here on the desk, called Cinema and Theater. The helpers gave this to Anne on a regular basis. So Anne put up posters of Hollywood stars, of the Dutch and of the British royal family, just the things that she liked, of prints that she thought that were pretty. But then a year later, we noticed that her interest changed. This is also what she writes in her diary. At first, she got the diary on her 13th birthday. She wanted to become a movie star, maybe play in the theater. But later on, she wanted to become a writer, and she was really interested in art. So what do we see here on this wall? We see a poster, a cutout of a self-portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, that she stuck onto what she called childish print. Now, this tells us a lot, how she developed as a person, how her character changed, how her interest changed within these walls of the secret annex, which is very special. What else do we see in here? We see her diary, which is on the desk. We see two beds, Anne's bed and Mr. Fritz Pfeffer's bed. Anne's bed with the chair. Remember, Morgan said she grew 13 centimeters. And she didn't get on well with Mr. Fritz Pfeffer. At the beginning, she was quite happy that he was there, because he was kind of like the mediator between the two families. But then, he had his own habits. He thought, why would a young girl, spend so much time at the desk? I'm a grown-up man. I need to study, I need to spend time at the desk. So this was a source of conflict. Mr. Fritz Pfeffer got up early mornings, even on Sunday. He did his exercises. Anne didn't really appreciate that. So Anne actually called him Mr. Albert Dussel in her diary. And Dussel is an old German word for idiot. So she didn't really got on well with him. And as you know, Kitty, her diary was also her best friend. So she told her diary everything. So in her diary, she calls him Albert the idiot. But other things, that we also learned from the diary is that Anne was, just a very normal girl. She wrote about everything that was on her heart, but she was very honest. For instance, she wrote about all her friends at school, what she didn't like about their looks, what she didn't like about their attitude. But she also wrote about her mom. For instance, she said, my dad is a sweetheart, but my mom, she's a role model for how I do not want to become one day, which is not really nice, right? But still, it's really honest the way she writes in there. And this is also why it makes it, very easy to also identify with Anne Frank, because she was not that angel, but she was this girl who did something extraordinary, with an extraordinary talent in these very, very dangerous and extraordinary situations that she was in. The next room that we will have a look at is a special place in the hiding place, also kind of a unique place, which was the bathroom of the hiding place. And Morgan will take over again.
Okay, so here we can see the bathroom of the hiding place. Now we know that Anne writes in her diary, they weren't able to use the bathroom anytime they wanted. They actually had a pretty rigid schedule for who was able to use it when. And I will show you part of the reason for this. We know that they had to be very quiet and hiding and be conscious of the people who were working below. Now, Erin mentioned that there were helpers who worked for this company that made it possible for them to live here for over 2 years. But that doesn't mean that everyone who worked here knew that they were there. There are people who worked below in the warehouse and on the floor down here who had no idea there were people in hiding above them. And so they had to be very conscious of this at all times. And you can see in red, this is the bathroom. And the pipes would run straight down through this area here. And is running water one time going to completely give away that there are people in hiding? No, of course not. But they didn't know how long they would be there. And over the course of months and eventually years, the sound of 8 people above them running 8 people's worth of water absolutely could tip off someone. And so they had to be very conscious of how much water they were using during the day, even how much they were walking around and how loud their voices were. Now, this room actually became a bit important to Anne, not quite as important as a space we'll see in a minute, but this was one of the only spaces that you could have any privacy in the hiding place. We just saw that Anne had to share a bedroom with a grown man, which Erin told us she was not happy about. And so coming in this space, she was able to focus on herself, get away for a minute and have a moment alone. Now, Erin was mentioning in her bedroom how Anne really was a normal girl. She was like anyone else. And that is so true. We also know that Anne was a very gifted writer, and she was incredibly wise for her age. And she was able to really analyze her situation with maturity that adults would even struggle with. And I think we have a lot to learn from her in this way. And one example of this is this ability that she had to hold two seemingly contradictory realities as true at the same time. Let me say that again. She could hold 2 seemingly contradictory realities as true at the same time. And again, I think that's something that we as adults even struggle with today. So, for example, that looked like Anne acknowledging that life was incredibly difficult in hiding. She fought with every single person in hiding just because that's what would happen if you had to live in a cramped space with certain people for 2 years. Not anything about their character, it would just happen. She acknowledged how difficult it was to not be able to go outside, not be able to see her friends, all of the constrictions that came with being in hiding. But at the same time, she also recognized how fortunate she was. She had this bathroom, she had running water, and that's something that we know that other people who went into hiding did not necessarily have. As a matter of fact, it was very rare, and she refers to their hiding place as the Taj Mahal of hiding places. She knows that she was fortunate to have this roof over her head, and she was fortunate that her family was able to be together. That's something else that, of course, we know that oftentimes families who were going to go into hiding couldn't always stay together and would often send children off for safety. And I think that we can all learn a little something from Anne in this today, when this past year has been really hard for everyone in some way. And we don't ever want to say that the coronavirus or what we've been experiencing this year is the same or remotely similar, honestly, to what Anne Frank went through. There's no comparison that can be made between a virus and identity-based violence, right? Those are completely different. But the ability to look at a hard situation and think through how to process that, that's something that we can learn from people in history who have experienced challenging times, and much more challenging times than what we're experiencing now, because we do know there are a lot of students who are experiencing isolation and loneliness right now. But we also know that there are things that we have right now to be thankful for, including this technology, right? And the ability to connect in this way. And so Anne was young But she was also very wise. And I think any of us who've read her diary would say that we have lots that we can learn from her, and the things that she writes about and the way that she looks at the world and the way she talks about acceptance and love and seeing people for who they are and not just the labels that society wants to put on them. So from here, we are going to leave the bathroom and we are going to come right back here where we started on this landing. And we're going to go up these very steep stairs, and then Erin is going to take over and show us the next room.
Okay, thank you, Morgan. So right now we're in the second floor of the secret annex. So we walked up the staircase, and this was actually the largest room in the secret annex. You see two beds behind there. These were the beds of Mr. and Mrs. Van Pels, August and Herman van Pels. So it was their bedroom at night, but during the day, all day long actually, this was the dining room, the living room, and as you can see, also the kitchen. So this is the place that the people in hiding in the secret annex spent most time together with. So what do you see on this table here? Now, this is a personal item that is also still in the Anne Frank house in the next room, actually, but this was Peter Van Pels's 16th birthday present, one of them. So he received this board game, which was like a Dutch early version of the Monopoly stock exchange game in the Netherlands, right? But this is what he received on his 16th birthday. Peter's room will be right out here. Now, when we talk about food, when we talk about the kitchen, we have to talk about the helpers, because those 761 days that the Frank family spent in the hiding place wouldn't have been possible without the helpers. So there were 6 helpers, 2 women and 4 men, who provided food, who provided news of the outside world, of personal friends, of what was happening, but also comfort. Who were there, who sometimes, spent the night in the hiding place. And, she had a very, very good relationship with Mipris, but also with Beb Voskuil. Beb was the youngest helper in her early 20s. And occasionally she, but also Mipris and her husband, spent the night in the secret annex, which was special for everybody who lived there. So helping was essential, was the only way the people in hiding could survive. And when Otto Frank actually, and Frank's father, asked Mipris and the others if they would help, they immediately said yes. Of course, these were difficult times, You were not only hiding Jews, you were also hiding criminals, because the time when the Frank family decided to go into hiding, they were considered criminals, right? And anybody who would turn them in would get the bounty, which was a lot of money in those days, a couple of weeks of salary. And it wasn't easy to get food. You couldn't just buy food. No, there were food stamps. Fortunately, the Mipris and her husband, her husband was active in the Dutch resistance movement, so he could use forged food stamps, for instance, so they had to be very inventive and creative. And helping, could be very dangerous. But Mipris and all the other helpers immediately said, hey, these are our friends, they're in need, we can help. So we did help. This is what she always wanted to say, what she always wanted to do. She would do it again. And this is also what makes Anne Frank's story special, the story of the helpers. Why did they help? Well, other people in need, these are human beings, just because of basic humanity, not thinking about the consequences, just because other people needed the help. So this is also one of the topics that we talk a lot about with our students in the workshop. All right, from this room, we'll actually walk through this door and reach the final area of the secret annex.
All right, so here we have the final furnished space of the secret annex. And this was the bedroom of Peter Van Pels. If you are familiar with Anne's story, then you know that there was a love interest there, but eventually phased out because Anne said that she wanted to focus on her writing and become a more serious author. Now today, this wardrobe is not here because when you walk through this space, those steep stairs that we pointed out earlier, we could not have people walking both ways up and down those stairs safely. And so there has been a walkway added here so that the tour actually continues through this space. So again, another reason this is a really special view of the hiding place, because this is where you would exit the tour here. And so this wardrobe is not there anymore. Now, Peter had this room all to himself. And some people would say, why in the world would Peter get this room to himself? Someone else should have had the space. Well, part of the reason for that is because, of course, the families wanted to stay together, but also because this space up this ladder that we're going to look at, this is the attic up here, there were rats. Not because there's anything wrong with the space, but because when a building is built in the 1600s, sometimes there are just going to be rats. And Peter had a cat with him. So Peter got the room just at the base of these stairs, and his cat helped keep the rats away. Now we want to make some time for questions, but I did want to just quickly show you this final space here. And this was a space I referred to earlier when we talked about having any privacy, the attic. No one slept up here because there was no insulation, so it got very cold in the winter time, but it was used for storage. And so Anne and Peter and Margot sometimes would come up here, and this was a very special place to get away and write or look out of this window at the famous tree that Anne writes about in her diary. So now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we have a little bit of time for some questions. Oh, looks like you're muted.
Yep.
Oops. Thank you, Aaron and Morgan, so much. And that was fascinating. And I know we have all learned so much. We have a little bit of time for some Q&A. So I'm going to take the questions from the chat. And if we don't get to every question and you still have more, everybody can email me all of the questions and I will forward them to Aaron and Morgan. And I'm sure they will have no problem getting back to us. So the first question we have is, how could the backyard neighbors, it obviously looks like they're very close together. You can see from where I'm standing, how did the background neighbors not hear any noise or know that people were there or see smoke coming through?
Well, actually, if we have a look at Anne's room here, you see those wooden frames with black cloth, and this was actually used in every room. We can also have a look at the other room. If we walk in here, you have those frames everywhere. And these were actually put on at night, to make sure that the neighbors wouldn't see light, but also for the time when the Allied forces bombed Amsterdam, the people in hiding didn't want to make themselves a target. So those were the main two reasons and also means by which they covered the windows, not to let out any light.
Great, thank you. Were there any other sources of information about the Franks' hiding place besides the diary? And where do all the specifics come from?
So the main source is Otto Frank. When he came back, he was very involved with the creation of this space. And he was able to describe very much of what was in the space, how they used it, what their day-to-day life looked like. But there were also the helpers who spent time in the hiding place as well. And so thankfully, we have firsthand information of what daily life was like, and how they passed the time, what kinds of supplies, like Erin was describing earlier. Margot Frank, we do know that she also kept a diary while she was in hiding, but it has never been found. So Anne's is the only diary that we have to look to, but thankfully there are also people that have been able to share with us what the hiding place was like.
There are a lot of primary sources that fortunately afterwards were still able to come and speak and visit the place and give tours.
Exactly, and
So-
all the helpers survived. Victor Kugler and Joe Kleinman were arrested, but both of them survived the war, and all the helpers could also tell us what the place used to look like.
And that's another reason that Anne's story is so powerful too, because sometimes we'll get this question, why Anne? What's so special about her? Why do we talk about her so much? And the real answer to that is that there's nothing that's, incredibly special about Anne that makes her different than any other child or victim. We just know so much more. So there are other hiding places that we don't have those sources, so we can't talk about them, but thankfully we do, so we can talk about her.
Right, absolutely. What were the rooms of the secret annex used for before the war?
Well, actually, they were used as storage and office rooms for the company, Opekta. The house itself was very special. It dates back to 1630. The house in the back, the back house, was actually demolished once and built up again about 100 years later. And Otto Frank actually looked for a house for his company with a warehouse, and this was the ideal house. Now, what the Frank family did to prepare the house, well, Otto and the helpers actually, so they emptied the back house, took out furniture, but also brought in furniture they really needed, and basically swapped, from the front house to the back house. But it was used before the war, and it was also used after the war, again for storage purposes. And then before the place was turned into a museum, so the museum opened in 1960, people who would have read the diary, it was already published in 1947, came to the house and asked the people who were working there, hey, can you please show us the hiding place, which actually happened.
Great, thank you. Do we know who turned them in and if there was a reason that they did so?
No, and that's definitely the question that comes up the most, no matter the audience. I saw one of the theories posted in the chat, but there are 10 more where that one came from. Everyone has their own theory. And the reality is that we just don't know. And there actually is a retired FBI agent who is spending lots of time moving over to the Netherlands to reopen this case and see if, using updated technologies, we can learn more about the truth of what happened. But actually now we don't even know for sure that they were even betrayed. Now there's a question of if they were discovered via a raid, right? So we know that there were often police raids where they would come and look for illegal activities like creating the false papers, passports, the ration cards that Erin spoke of as a part of the underground market and resistance. And so there's now a question of maybe if they were just coming to look for illegal activity and they happened upon them. So we really don't know. You can find lots of theories online, but maybe now with this FBI agent looking into it, we'll get a little more information before too long.
Thanks, that is fascinating. I know if those of you that aren't reading the chat, I've seen that theory too, that it was a sister of one of the helpers. We don't know that there's truth to that. And I've also noticed what you mentioned, Morgan, the last time I was in Amsterdam. I also went on a tour of other places that were used for hiding and underground activity on the canal. And it was known that many of these annexes existed in different places. So it's quite possible that they were just looking for them. This is an interesting question. If all of the furniture was taken or stolen, and if Otto wanted the house to remain empty, what is it that you're seeing there now? What are those images that we're seeing on the screen?
Well, what we see right now is actually the real dimensions of the room. These are 360 degrees renderings of the room. And the wallpaper in Anne Frank's room actually still looks the same because it's the original wallpaper. It has lots of water stains on it, but more than 80% of the pictures that Anne Frank put on there are still there, right? So when the place was raided, right, and Anne's writings, her diary, and loose pages were in this special bag. And what the police did, actually, they threw out they emptied the bag, threw the writings on the floor and put valuable things in there, and took it with them. And later on, the furniture company took away all the furniture. So all of this was gone. But what we still do have, we have those personal items. For instance, Edith's prayer books, some of which are still there. Margot's Latin lessons that she completed, but Beb, one of the helpers, sent in her name, And these are the little things that are in each room. In the kitchen, so in the second floor, there's one of the menu cards that Anne wrote in. It was like a mixture of Dutch and French, because it was a menu and it's something special for Jan Gies and Miep Gies' first anniversary. This also basically survived, right? But it's totally empty, but with those items on the walls.
So these are the things that you can see in person today. And so what we're looking at is all virtual reality, right? So it's not physically there. But while he was still alive, Otto Frank was able to describe the furniture that was there, right? And so everything you're seeing today is based off of the descriptions. And at some point, there was actually a physical, they actually did get some furniture that would have looked similar to document and kind of position what it would have looked like to get Otto's approval of that. And so we have the digital versions of that.
Great, thank you. Somebody wrote, and I know this is true, has Eva Schloss, Otto's second wife's daughter, who is also Anne's age, has she ever been involved with the Anne Frank house or visited?
Yes, definitely. Actually, she has been involved for a very long time now, as a Holocaust survivor herself. She initially never wanted to talk about what she went through. And in the late 1970s, she actually started to doing that, and speaking in front of, thousands of students all over the world. Actually, Eva has been to South Carolina. Morgan and I have been with her for a couple of days, talking to students, talking to middle school students. Right now she's on Zoom, talking to students. I actually, when I started in Anne Frank House as a volunteer in 2002, the first guided tour that I did through the Anne Frank House was with Eva Schloss. And we went to Otto Frank's office, and she said, oh, so this is where Anne was sitting down. And of course, this is where Otto Frank was sitting down doing his work, so that was really special. But she's, always visiting, and she's been heavily involved in our activities.
Great, thank you. How is it safe for Peter to keep a cat in the hiding place? Wouldn't the cat have made noise?
Yes, she would have, but I think there were, and Morgan, correct me if I'm wrong, in total about 4 cats that played a role in the diary, but also in the hiding place. Now, Peter was allowed to bring his cat into the hiding place. The cat was called Mushi, but then there were other cats that were like office cats. And Peter was also in this kind of like space, which wasn't a real room, but it was the connection to the attic. And what did you have up in the attic? You had rats and mice because of the food that was stored in this attic and in other attics. Yeah, so it wasn't uncommon at all to have cats, and it wasn't suspicious to have the cats.
That is an interesting point of a little bit of contention, actually, because Anne had a cat that was not allowed to go into hiding. Her parents said, no, it would be distracting and we don't want to have to worry about this. And that highlights something that we see in the diary where Anne talks about how difficult it was for two families with two different parenting styles to be in the same place, right? Like that's a tough thing. And so that's kind of an example of this set of parents said yes and this set of parents said no, and they just had to figure out how to live with that.
Yeah, very interesting. And we know that's the case still today with parenting all across the world, with some parents allowing things, some parents not.
Making it awkward.
Exactly. So nothing's changed much. We're going to end with this question, the last one, but also, as I said, if anyone has more questions, please feel free to email me and I'm happy to get those to Morgan and Erin. So the last question we have is, do we know anything about what happened to the people that actually arrested the Franks and the people in the secret annex?
Yes, actually we do. Now, basically, there were Dutch police officers, and the officer in charge of the arrest was an officer called Karl Josef Silberbauer. And he was an officer from Vienna. And that's very special again, because he was a very fanatic, dedicated Nazi who dedicated his entire life to the Nazi cause. Miep Gies, she was also from Vienna. She was Miep Santoschitz. This was her maiden name. She came to the Netherlands many years before because of the famine in and around Vienna, right? And she had a better life in the Netherlands. She stayed and she married. But there's Miep, who is from Vienna, from Austria, and risks her life to protect her friends, And then there's this Austrian, from the world's capital of anti-Semitism in those days, Vienna, who dedicates his life to arrest Jews, and those met in the secret hiding place, and Miep tried to bribe him. It didn't work out, but they knew, okay, hey, he's from Vienna, she's from Vienna. This is how they kind of like suddenly noticed, because of this common regional dialect that they have, And I'm also from Austria, so I can also immediately tell a Viennese dialect, right? But in the 1960s, it became apparent that Karl Josef Silberbauer, who was retired already, was the officer in charge of the arrest, and he was actually never charged. He always said, yeah, I had to do it, otherwise I would have been punished myself. But a couple of years later, and we have those documents at the Anne Frank house, we found his application forms, and we're with a motivational letter. Well, this tells you everything you need to know about this man, why he took this job. But nothing ever happened to him in a legal sense. It became apparent that he was the officer in charge of the arrest, together with Dutch policemen.
If I can add one thought to that as well, that is fascinating to me. When they came and when they arrested everyone in hiding, there was a trunk that I think was actually even visible in the tour that belonged to Otto Frank. And it had patches on it that showed that Otto Frank was a high-ranking member of the German military in World War I. And because of the propaganda against Jewish people and the way that they had been portrayed by the government, this arresting officer, there was this moment where you could, I've heard it said, I did not hear this from Otto myself, of course, but I've heard it said that there was this moment of confusion in his eyes where he saw this trunk, and it was almost like, how could a Jewish person possibly have been a high-ranking member of the German military that I'm so proud to be affiliated with, right? Because he had been brainwashed to think that Jewish people, of course, were inferior, right? And so he couldn't wrap his brain around how this was even possible. And he looked at Otto and he looked back, and, they say Otto always thought that he gave them a little bit more time to pack than he normally would have, because he saw a little bit of humanity in him and a little bit of himself in him, and realized maybe there is something we have in common, even if this man is Jewish and I've been taught to hate him. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough to make a difference in the fate of the people that were in hiding, but I find it very interesting, just that he would have this reaction to seeing military paraphernalia associated with Otto Frank, who was Jewish, and not really know how to wrap his head around that.
So interesting. Thank you both so much for sharing everything tonight. I know I learned a lot. Everybody here learned a lot, and we're all so excited to one day, hopefully soon, be able to actually visit the Anne Frank House and be able to connect and see more and share what we've learned. But from what we've taken tonight, this was truly a treat for all of us. I'm going to turn the program over to our UJA campaign chair, Michael Goldberg. Michael?
Thank you. I hope everyone had a nice trip back and doesn't have any jet lag. Thank you, Aaron, Morgan, and Elise, for a fascinating tour. There are many Holocaust survivors and their families who reside in our community, and it gives me great pride to share the important ways that Federation cares for over 300 survivors who are the most vulnerable. In partnership with the Jewish Family Service agencies, we help meet survivors' medical and emotional needs, providing at-home care, kosher meals on wheels, assistance with getting the services they are entitled to, and social programs to keep them active. Through our Holocaust Council, we keep stories alive, giving them a platform to share their life story with adults and students of all ethnic groups. The work that Federation does every day to help those in need and educate our young leaders is only possible because of your generosity. As my wife says, it is never enough. So I am pleased to share that through April 30th, we have a one-to-one match on any new and increased gifts to the annual campaign. Thank you for trusting us to care for and build our community. Good night.